Good morning or afternoon, NCIA members and supporters. We're here joined by Scott Seeley and James Granger, members of NCIA's Cannabis Manufacturing Committee, for a pre-webinar prep session to get everybody on the same page about the minor, novel, and synthetic cannabinoid issue. We're going to be diving deep into this subject today, setting the stage and making sure that everybody that comes to our live broadcast later this fall and winter is prepared and up to speed on these updates across the board in the industry. So with that, I'll turn it right over to our esteemed panelists, Scott Seeley and James Granger, to dive into today's presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to post them into the registration process that you'll all be directed to following the recording of today's session. So with that, Scott and James, you can kick it off right from here.
Thank you much, Brian. Welcome everyone to NCIA's Minor, Novel, and Synthetic Cannabinoids presentation. Thank you for taking the time to learn about a new trend in the cannabis industry that has emerged as cannabis continues to be studied and new cannabinoid compounds continue to be identified and derived for research and product development.
Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Seeley. I'm a patent attorney at Eastgate IP with a background in biochemistry and a practice focusing primarily on patent and trademark procurement. So as James said, we'll be walking you through the categories of compounds outside of the big two majorly known ones of THC and CBD. So as the industry has grown, additional cannabinoids continue to be identified, isolated, and manufactured. And so our focus today will be on minor, novel, and synthetic cannabinoids. Well, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on, what's known about these compounds, and what the industry can do to move forward and provide safe products to consumers.
So as we said, this presentation will provide a brief overview of minor, novel, and synthetic cannabinoids. To start, it would make sense to lay out some of the foundational terminology so we are all on the same page with how these terms are used in this presentation. After we've established a brief review of the classes of compounds and some examples of each, we will discuss some lingering issues related to testing, quality control, and safe production of these compounds to develop a path forward towards a safe and responsible consumer experience.
So minor cannabinoids are generally those that are found in lower concentrations relative to the major cannabinoids, such as delta-9 THC. Novel cannabinoids are those that are newly identified and therefore not super well documented. These can be synthesized or biologically derived. And then synthetic cannabinoids are those that were produced in a lab rather than by a plant. And synthetic versions of many major and minor cannabinoids have already been prepared, while others are still under development.
Let's continue by diving a little deeper on the difference between major and minor cannabinoids. Generally, the main distinction lies in the mass of the molecules commonly found in the cannabis strains. While there's great variation in ratios in cannabis and hemp plants around the world, these are generalities regarding compound ratios that we can draw on for the sake of discussion here. Minor cannabinoids typically exist in small concentrations, such as less than about 5%. This can include THC and CBD depending on a particular strain, but generally, when speaking about minor cannabinoids, the main focus of discussion tends to be the other different variants of these compounds that exist in very small quantities in the plant.
Continuing along with some of the differences in how some of these terms are used, there's still a lingering debate over the proper terminology to use to describe the effects of these compounds. There can be a lot of nuance in this area, and the terminology can often carry different connotations, so it's important to pay attention to the words that we use. Consistent terminology can also help provide clarity in the minds of consumers and improve the quality of the inevitable regulation, since it's in everyone's best interest that regulatory agencies use accurate and consistent terminology in order to effectively decide on action concerning the production and usage of these compounds in the marketplace. Some of the terms that come up around this topic include impairment, which refers to reduced cognitive or physical abilities, intoxication, which usually refers to a transient condition where your cognition or perception is infected, inebriation usually refers to intoxication through alcohol, and then psychoactive and psychotropic tend to refer to having an effect on one's brain chemistry. There can be a lot of debate about these terms. For example, whether CBD should be considered psychoactive if it affects your brain chemistry to alleviate anxiety but doesn't produce a high feeling in the traditional sense of the term. So for this presentation, we'll usually be using the word psychoactive to refer to something that affects your brain chemistry in some way, and then altered state or high inducing to refer to something like delta-9 THC, which produces a high in the traditional sense.
Naturally occurring cannabinoids can be found in the plant in different amounts depending on the cultivar strain in question. The naturally occurring cannabinoids can be generally split into two major classes: the THC molecules, which are all structurally similar to delta-9 THC, and the CBD molecules, which are all structurally similar to CBD.
As a brief overview of what these molecules are and how they relate to one another, The dash A's generally denote the inactive acid form of the compound. The dash V's generally denote the varin forms having a shortened side chain. They're generally less high inducing, but that effect can be dose dependent. Among the THCs, we have delta 8, delta 9, where the delta usually just refers to where a double bond is located on one of those rings. However, these minor differences in structure can lead to a very different effect in effect of the compound on users. And we'll discuss that on the next slide.
Through extensive scientific research, we can look at each of these molecules individually and categorize their effects. In general, more detailed research is needed on all minor novel and synthetics to determine their best use in the future. Some of the highlights of this graph to note are THCv, the delta 8 THCs, CBN, CBL. There are a large variety with a large amounts of effects, warranting much more research. There are perceived psychedelic effects for things like THCv, CBG, CBGA, potential bone growth stimulants, and CBN, potentially glaucoma treatments. There are a number of these that have future use, and we hope to do more research on those in the future and really dive deep into those compounds.
Yeah, absolutely. So one minor cannabinoid that's come up a lot recently is delta 8 THC. This tends to produce altered states or a traditional high feeling. It exists in trace amounts in the plant, so it's technically a minor cannabinoid, but it can be created in a lab in much higher quantities. And so it's been coming up a lot in the news recently, especially since it's so easily converted from CBD. And CBG is also a good one to point out. CBG is considered the mother cannabinoid. It's the base compound that a lot of the other compounds are derived from within the plant. And it's interesting that even though a large amount of CBG is produced, it tends to be converted into other compounds like THC and CBD. So means the CBG element itself tends to be a minor cannabinoid in the plant.
One other note on the THCv that seems very interesting and research is developing around this is potential blood glucose regulation. Also along the lines of CBN, which is becoming a very popular minor cannabinoid that is supposedly has sleep assisting properties, which we're very excited about. One other thing to note is these molecules are produced not by yeast and other biosynthetic processes. As that technology develops and grows, you will see more compounds being developed in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And many of these compounds are also synthesized in labs from other precursors, such as CBD or CBG. And in some instances, they can be completely prepared from a completely different starter reagent, but that tends to be less common. One synthetic cannabinoid that's been common in the marketplace for some time already is actually marinol. So this is a synthetic THC. It's delta 9 THC. It's just prepared in a lab. And this has actually been FDA approved since the 1980s. So we do have strong evidence that some of these compounds can be prepared safely and effectively in a lab, but less evidence exists for some of the more newly discovered compounds, which brings a need for more research. Absolutely.
There are one more cannabinoid to note is the HHC, HHCO, and HHC acetate subcategory. Similar effects to THC, but potentially an even more high-inducing compound that is coming up, involving a much more complicated system of production. It's also a molecule that's not typically found in the plant. However, we are seeing that reach the marketplace, and much more research on that is most certainly needed. Here's an informal graph generally indicated some perceived effects of the compounds we've been talking about. It's important to note that mental effects are inherently subjective and that everyone experiences and processes cannabinoids differently. Nevertheless, some generalizations can be made to help understand how these compounds relate to one another.
Yeah, so generally speaking, the THC compounds produced a more pronounced high-inducing feeling. Conversely, the CB molecules tend to produce less perceptible changes in cognition, but do tend to affect your feelings of anxiety or depression. It's important to note that many of these minor cannabinoids are relatively novel in the marketplace, so there's been little opportunity to really evaluate their effects. This provides a useful opportunity for researchers to further isolate and identify the actual effects of these compounds, but it also serves as a warning to consumers that not all of these compounds are as well documented as others.
It's a very good point. By their nature, these compounds tend to exist in small quantities in the plant, excluding a few like HHC molecules, leading to the problem of how to scale the production of these useful compounds for effective commercialization. These are a few ways to achieve that result. Extracting them naturally can be expensive for minor cannabinoids, specifically because they don't exist in large amounts of the plants, and the cost viability for doing so would be very prohibitive. It's can be useful with a specific cultivar that produces a desired compound in higher qualities. However, the other methods tend to be a more popular way of deriving these. Biosynthesis, as mentioned before, inserting a transgene into an organism to cause the organism to produce the compound of interest, has been seen to be a possible future for producing all cannabinoids without the need for production of biomass and the surrounding expense of agriculture in general.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And then a lot of these compounds can also be synthetically prepared from a precursor analog. And usually that'll take one of two methods. The simplest way tends to be leveraging the knowledge that all of these molecules are close structural relatives of one another. So if you can find one compound that's similar to what you're aiming for, you can convert one cannabinoid into another. And that's commonly what's happening with, for example, delta-8 THC and CBD. But you can also convert from other starting reagents that have nothing to do with cannabis. This can be difficult because it can be difficult to identify an appropriate starting reagent, and the synthetic steps to arrive at your desired compound can be more complicated. But where a desired starting reagent is unavailable naturally in the plant, this can be a good alternative.
All right. Well, with knowledge of how to create these compounds readily available on the internet, the issue arises of quality control and production methodologies in the process. As with most manufacturing methods, there are many ways to execute a process, but care should be taken to create products intended to be consumed by humans safely in a large-scale setting. Byproducts can and do occur in chemical reactions, and it needs to be addressed to what those are so we can verify through testing that the products contain what they say they contain and not more that cannot or have not been identified. It is critical that we utilize safe and well understood methodologies to produce these compounds in a responsible manner to ensure public safety and to avoid drawing regulatory ire.
So one thing that's worth considering here is the quantity of unknowns that often show up in consumer products. So we have an example certificate of analysis on this slide here, and it's common in the industry to see certificates of analysis for THC isolates in the 70 to 85% range. But this means that the remaining 30 to 15% is some unknown or uncharacterized constituent. So as more minor compounds are extracted and purified, and as other synthetic cannabinoids are produced and manufactured, the industry needs to be careful to isolate the desired compounds from the reaction mixture to increase consumer confidence in the end product and avoid drawing undue regulatory scrutiny. Improved testing and purification techniques can help reduce the quantity of impurities present in the end product, and improved manufacturing techniques can help characterize these other compounds to the extent they remain in the final product to inform consumers of what they're intaking.
Overall, we as a civilization have progressed in our abilities in the lab to produce an amazing number of compounds safely through very dangerous processes. Personal protective equipment, standards of production, and testing are available to create anything from aspirin to plutonium. However, we wouldn't want our medicine or dangerous compounds coming from a lab that does not follow safety, health, or testing standards.
Yeah, so proper safety standards should begin with responsible and adequate self-regulation within the industry. And as with all things, external regulation is to be expected, but by practicing safe and responsible manufacturing practices, we can help avoid drawing undue scrutiny and pave a path for success towards the future. Some things that the industry can do to develop safe and effective manufacturing techniques to provide high purity, well-characterized products to consumers include using well-documented manufacturing practices, working with standards organizations like ASTM to lay the framework for others to follow through the establishment of broadly adopted testing standards and access to certified reference materials. These are all major steps that manufacturers can do to practice responsibly and safely in the industry.
Now, what the industry needs and how regulators can help us. What the industry really needs is currently as a baseline for us to do our work. The recent passage of the Cannabinoid Research Bill in DC, pending final approval, is a great step forward in allowing research institutions to develop and work on these needs list, and encouragement from all sides needs to be given as these compounds are becoming more and more prevalent in the marketplace and already essentially being field tested on the general public without knowledge of the long-term effects or even the full knowledge of what's in the product to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. So manufacturers and consumers, we all have a joint interest in promoting safe and efficient marketplace that provides a well-characterized and safely manufactured product to its consumers. And we all want to avoid situations where backyard chemists are attempting to isolate impure compounds through dangerous methodologies.
What we want to prevent here is another spice race where we are throwing things in a reactor and seeing what sticks to avoid the regulatory structure that exists. Many people were and still are harmed by unknowns. However, we can overcome these unknowns and hopefully develop solutions, compounds, formulas that can be useful and helpful in the future. And we'll look back at the times when we only stood THC and CBD as cannabis. As we look back into the dark age of knowledge resulting from prohibition, if even one of these compounds is found to have a profound effect on health, we owe it to society to keep researching, learning, and developing safely this segment of our industry. Thank you for your time, and please reach out to any of the contact information provided for more information.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Scott and James, for presenting this presentation that's really going to set the stage for a more in-depth and interactive educational experience alongside additional NCIA members and supporters later this winter. Stay on the lookout for more details about that schedule or for that program when they are scheduled for the first or second week of December. And you can follow the link in the blog post that you all see here to sign up today. Thank you all so much for watching this prep session to prepare you for an interactive Industry Essentials webinar later this fall. We'll see you all then.